Hey guys, it's Ryan here with HobbiesofaMan. Once again, and today we're going to be doing another comic book by the issue review. Today we're going to be looking at something new. So this new series came out, Helen of Wyndhorn came out, and it's by Tom King, by Bilquis Evely, Matthew Lopez, and Clayton Cowles, right? And this is the same team that worked on Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow, which is supposed to be a really great Supergirl series that I own digitally. I have not read it yet, but I am pretty inclined to do so after reading this first issue, right? So, yeah, anyway, Helen of Wyndhorn is kind of difficult to define. On one hand, you could kind of call it a sword and sorcery type series, kind of like Conan, or maybe something like The Witcher, which is a more modern interpretation of the sword and sorcery, especially the short stories, right? Or something like Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, stuff like that, right? Pulpy 1920s and later type stories, right? You know, stuff that came out after Edgar Rice Burroughs made Tarzan and John Carter of Mars, right? Stuff like that. And on the other hand, it almost has this kind of like gothic, I think is the right terminology, the right time period, literature vibe to it. Not exactly like Frankenstein, but if I were to call it Victorian, I'm not sure that would be correct either, right? Like, I think it's past Victorian, but not quite into like, you know, something more modern. I think Gothic is the right terminology here. And it's about this, you know, girl that lives in a manor, and the manor is weird, right? And that kind of makes sense, right? So, yeah, but it's not just about that. It's also about the sword and sorcery aspects, right? So, that's kind of the premise of the story. Let's actually look at what happens in this volume, in this issue. And yeah, I'm pretty excited about it. So this book actually opens with this really interesting, kind of very pulpy, almost Frank Frazetta type kind of image, right? It's still in Bilquis' style. Like, don't get me wrong, it's not a Frazetta-like painting. But what I'm getting at is that it alludes to something like that, right? Something that Frank Frazetta or Boris Vallejo would kind of draw, right? Like the same kind of style, even if the way that the art is quite different, right? But the poses and kind of the focus of characters is like that. And then we transition to this older woman who narrates basically this story to a young reporter. And she basically talks about meeting Helen. It turns out that this woman was Helen's matron or whatever it's called, like the lady that takes care of a young lady to educate her and to help her along. And she's not necessarily her maid, but not exactly like someone that has power over her. It's someone in between. I'm not really sure what the right terminology is. She mentions it, but I just can't remember it off the top of my head right now, right? And so she talks about how Helen's grandfather, who I can't remember the name of, hired her and then sent her off to Texas to go find her his granddaughter, right? And so she goes to Texas. She ends up in a little town off San Antonio, and finds Helen. And Helen is a 16-year-old, you know, cigarette addicted lush, which means she's super drunk all the time, and she basically is more or less living out of the prison of this little town because her father has recently died. She kind of got her inheritance from him more or less, but it wasn't really much. And she's kind of just living her life, kind of waiting for it all to end. And it just isn't going that well, right? However, this lady comes in, she takes her, she forces her to kind of clean up a bit. They talk a bit, in the sense that, you know, she tells her why she's there, what's going on, and eventually manages to convince Helen to go with her to Wyndhorn. Before they do that, they take the time to set up a nice statue, or kind of like a little mausoleum type thing, over her dad's grave. So he doesn't have a basic ass tombstone, and she tells the guy that she's hiring for this, you know, by the time I come back, you better have something awesome there, right? And he says he'll take care of it, and then they leave, right? They manage to make it to Wyndhorn, which is up somewhere northeast, I think. And basically we get a tour of the mansion. We get to meet Joseph, who is basically the Alfred to Helen's grandfather, who would be the Batman in this case. But we don't get to see her grandfather because he's not home right now. He is off at work, apparently. Eventually, we kind of have a little bit of a time skip where Helen has settled in, and she has these night terrors, right? And doesn't care about her lessons. And eventually, the governess, I think is the right word that I was looking for earlier, takes pity on Helen, lets her sleep with her, and eventually kind of like they develop a bond, right? Of some sort. Not necessarily, the best type of bond that you can think of, but a good enough one that Helen is willing to talk to her about some of her issues that she's facing, which is more or less that there's monsters around the mansion. And, Miss Appleton doesn't really believe her exactly until one day she hears these screams, right? At night, and she comes running down from her room in the mansion down to the front door, where she finds Helen, who's running like crazy away from this big, like, bat monster, I guess. It's a little bit like a minotaur, but it has the face of a bat. But it's also kind of its own very different creature, and it's quite cool looking. I actually really enjoy how this monster looks. I think the design for it is quite good. And she's being chased by this bat minotaur when suddenly, right before it's about to, eat Helen, it turns around and it tries to see what's going on because it kind of sees something, and then wham, he gets cut into, bisected, bifurcated by Grandpa, who's back from his job. And, that's basically where we're left off. There's a little bit of a wrap-up here where Miss Appleton mentions, that it's understandable that the young reporter doesn't want to listen to her, that doesn't want to believe what she's saying, but it's all true, right? And so it was quite good, quite interesting, quite exciting. Even though, maybe more or less almost no action happened here, but the world building and the setting and the way that the story was told was very enjoyable, very interesting. I quite liked this. I thought it was very well written. And it's really good stuff. I'm very excited to read the next issue. However, that issue already came out this week, and for some reason there was a bit of a kerfuffle at my local comic book store, so I didn't get my copy this week. However, hopefully I should get it next week, and if not, I'll have to go down to a different comic book shop near here and see if they have an extra copy for me, because I'm very excited to see what comes next here, right? So, overall, this was great. If you're interested in sword and sorcery type stuff, if you like fantasy stuff that isn't high fantasy stuff, that isn't super serious about itself, and you kind of like this kind of slightly different take, and you're interested in seeing something not quite like other sword and sorcery stories you've read before, I recommend you check this out. It's quite enjoyable. It's very fun. The art style is great. It's quite weird, but it's also very enjoyable to look at. The art style is phenomenal. The coloring is great. And the lettering in the story is also quite good. I mean, I don't really have too much to say about lettering. I really don't know too much about it, except for the fact that sometimes it looks great and sometimes it looks bad. And in this case, I think it was Clayton Coles that does the work here for the lettering. Did a great job with it. And Tom King did a great job with the story. So, yeah, I don't know. Overall, very good stuff. I recommend you read it. And that's all I have to say. So thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed. And see you guys later.